Uh, good noon, all. I'm very happy to see so many people come for our speaker today, Natalie Koch, who is a visitor with the Global Asia Initiative. The Global Asia Initiative is a unit within TUSIGS here, and we have a collaboration. One of our central programs is a collaboration with the Social Science Research Council based in New York and their Inter-Asia program. We are a hub for the Inter-Asia program, and I'm pleased to say that Natalie was one of our fellows and has also participated in our international conferences that we've had. I believe you were in Istanbul, right? That was 2013 or 14, I think. Yes, at any rate, she's also here on the last batch of that funding that we had for Inter-Asia Fellows, and but I don't think she will be doing the last presentation this year. But anyway, enough of the program. And about Natalie, Natalie is an associate professor of geography and O'Hanley faculty scholar at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. She is originally and continues to be, I think, a political geographer working on nationalism, authoritarianism, and state theory. With a regional focus on Central Asia and the Arabian Peninsula, she examines alternative sites of geopolitics such as spectacle, science and higher education, environmental policy, and post-oil development schemes in resource-rich states. She is the author of The Geopolitics of Spectacle, Space, Synecdoche, and the New Capitals of Asia from Cornell University Press, published only very recently, last year, I think. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for being here today and for the invitation. It's really an honor. I have a habit of wandering a little bit, but I will try and stay right here at the podium. Wave at me if you can't hear me, or if there's any other clarification points that you might have as we go through. So the project that I want to talk to you today about is one that I sort of fell into somewhat recently, looking at connections between my home state of Arizona, which is where I grew up, and the Arabian Peninsula, where I've been working for about the last 8 years. So this project, as I just said, is something I somewhat fell into. I had noticed, growing up in Arizona, various sort of connections with the Middle East, but I never really analytically started to consider what that meant or what those connections were. And so as I started to explore this project, it became bigger and bigger. One of the case studies is what I will be talking about today. But in addition to this connection between Saudi Arabia and Arizona that I'll talk about, I'm also working on projects about the United Arab Emirates and Oman. If anybody's particularly interested in the Oman case, I will present on that at Chapel Hill tomorrow. All right, so with the case in Arizona, though, with the case of Saudi Arabia, what really caught my attention in this entire project was specifically the reporting around what you see being depicted here from this Phoenix magazine article. And this was specifically when Saudi Arabia's largest dairy company, Almarai, and the largest dairy company in the Middle East, Almarai, purchased this farm outside of Vicksburg or near Vicksburg, Arizona. So you can see an image of this. This is from December, courtesy of my brother's wonderful drone photography skills, of the alfalfa fields where they're growing alfalfa. There's some cattle that are being held here at this farm as well. And this is the sort of the Google satellite view of this farm. So when I heard about this story several years ago, so the acquisition actually happened in 2014. When I heard about it, I thought to myself, why why would the Saudis be coming to Arizona? Why is Arizona still growing alfalfa and producing this sort of crop in the middle of the desert? I sort of naively thought, having left the state some years before, that perhaps things had changed and that we had gotten wiser. No, I am sorry to say. There's a lot of reasons that this particular development took place, and so I started to look into that and explore the reasons why, and also encountered that it is quite a historical story, as we'll see. So Almarai, as I mentioned, is the largest dairy company in Saudi Arabia and in the Middle East. It has it was established in 1976, and it has now become quite a massive operation. And you can, if anybody's really interested, you can see some visuals of it. National Geographic from the UAE has a lovely documentary about Almarai in particular. But Almarai has it has its base in Saudi Arabia, but it also has land and farms in other parts of the world. And this process really started to shift in around 2014 when they started to get these farms abroad. You can see that in the United States, there are 2 farms, and one is the Vicksburg farm, and the other one is in Blythe, California, which is about a 30-minute, 40-minute drive from the other farm. So they're quite close with one another. They also have farms in Argentina, a little bit southwest of Cordoba, and then, as you can see, they have some Eastern European farms, which I actually haven't looked into those recently. I don't know if they still own those, but I'm assuming they are. So Saudi Arabia has started to, or the Saudi Dairy Company has started to reach into other territories. And the question is specifically why? Why are they doing this? Why would you be getting alfalfa and cattle feed in other countries? What is the logic for that? And perhaps more fundamentally, why does Saudi Arabia even have a dairy industry? Like, how did that come about? And why is it such an important force in Saudi Arabia today? So these are all questions or sort of for me as I started to look into this particular case of the acquisition of the farm in Arizona. Specifically also, as you can see, as I would hope that you can see from some of these images, that this sparked a lot of controversy and concern and anxiety within Arizona, and also to some extent at the national, in the national news media. But it is also a narrative that is really quickly sort of lapsing into a kind of Orientalism, right? And that's at least what I see in a lot of these images, where you have this juxtaposition of Arizona's iconography with Saudi Arabia, that somehow Saudi Arabia is taking us over. There is this general anxiety about foreign farmland acquisitions, whether it's Saudi or not, about being taken over, being part of this sort of global land grab. And I should also make a caveat on this point, specifically that Saudi Arabia is one of the most stigmatized countries, I would say, just as somebody who studies the place, in the United States. But just next door to this Saudi farm is an Emirati one. So the Emirati dairy company Al Dara has a farm that's exactly adjacent. The media rarely talks about that. If they do, it's kind of a footnote, right? So this kind of speaks to the way that Saudi Arabia is understood to be a lightning rod for these conversations within the United States, a kind of nationalist anxiety about Saudi infiltration or Saudi influence that is deemed problematic. So as a political geographer, I'm also particularly interested in how this particular case has been read and coded and treated as a sort of politically and culturally sensitive case. So as I mentioned, a lot of the coverage and the discussion immediately sort of focused on this bigger narrative of the land grab. Is this a land grab, or is this a benign strategy? Or in some cases, you might hear some of the terms being a water grab. Or, in speaking with my relatives in Arizona, that they basically are saying, oh, the Saudis are coming to take our water. So this is a really common narrative that you see. And it's not not just in these news headlines that we have this bigger narrative about water grabbing or land grabbing. It is actually part of now a scholarly analysis, and much of this was sort of provoked, or at least initially these conversations started in the media, but also within academia, after this one report from Grain, this institution called Seized, the 2008 land grab. So this really sort of jumped onto the international community's radar, largely in response to this report, and it provoked all of these discussions. But as you can see, there's this bigger narrative that there are these outside forces that are coming in and taking our land out from under us, shaking off the farmers or whoever may be there. These narratives, as you can already sort of guess, I find somewhat problematic. And one of the reasons that I find them problematic is that those hands are not attached to any bodies. So I want to know whose hands are those that are stealing this land? And how can we actually have a discussion about politics when we don't identify human beings and actors and decision makers who are doing this? So in any sort of conversation about these discourses, I want to ask, who are those people, who are those actors, and how can we trace their agency and their decision-making processes, rather than just sort of falling into this easy label that just becomes a cliche for thinking. Okay, so this is something I see in a lot of the academic literature about this, and there's this book in particular, The Global Land Grab Beyond the Hype, which actually does a decent job of trying to get beyond the hype and actually trace some of those actors and say, what are these processes, what is actually going on here? So this is where I'm sort of coming from. In addition to that, I want to try to understand the political economy of these decisions. What is it specifically that makes it economical for Saudi Arabia to buy a farm in Arizona and ship that alfalfa that they're growing there back to Saudi Arabia to feed their cows there? How does that relationship make sense? In a lot of ways, it actually does. And so that's something that these scholars, in particular Adam Hania and Eckhard Wurtz, have talked about in tracing the sort of political economy of food and the reach of major dairy companies, sovereign wealth funds, and other institutions within the Gulf into the agri-commodity circuits, and that they now play a very large role in many of these different agricultural circuits. So, for example, the largest grain exporter in the United States is Al-Dawra, that Emirati dairy company that I mentioned before. So a lot of this is happening quietly, and we're not necessarily attending to it because these are not very sexy topics, frankly, right? Agriculture, grain, but this is one way that these Gulf institutions have really exerted quite a lot of influence. So this is part of a bigger project that I'm working on about how do you consider geopolitics through different lenses, and in particular, looking at these connections between the Arabian Peninsula and Arizona as an example of this, of desert-to-desert connections, and specifically this idea of food scarcity or food security, or the sort of tenuous, precarious nature of food supplies in desert contexts is one point that we will see unites these actors in both contexts. So as I mentioned, one of the main questions I have is how are deserts of the world connected? How can we map those connections? Because as I just mentioned, a lot of these things are kind of invisible. So how do we actually trace them and follow those connections when they're kind of strategically perhaps outside of our vision? And then how can this sort of mapping be used to subvert some of the conventional approaches to geopolitics? So I am a political geographer. I, came up through the tradition of geopolitics, and I've always, we have a habit of critiquing the state as a construct, and critiquing state-based approaches to politics to say that it is much more. But then what? how might we do that otherwise? How might we imagine geopolitics and conversations about geopolitics beyond just the statist language? So this project on the deserts is just one way that I'm sort of exploring to think about different ways of narrating that. So as I mentioned, a lot of this is very historical. I won't spend very much time on this. This is just kind of a very quick overview of some of the food geopolitics and the political economy issues that really shape how we got to the place that we did in Saudi Arabia and why they would be buying a farm in Arizona. So first, from the 1930s to 1960s, the British had a tradition of setting up these agricultural experiment stations or research centers in the various colonial territories. They started to do something similar in the Gulf region as well, and the United States started to get involved in this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there's a lot of investment in agriculture as a way to modernize these colonial territories, but then sort of fast forwarding a lot to the 1970s, we have what might be called the World Food Crisis. Some people would put a different end date on that, maybe 1975. And paired with that, we have the 1973 oil crisis related to OPEC. And it is at this moment, so several scholars sort of point to the fact that Nixon starts to threaten the OPEC embargoing nations with a food embargo if they continue with their oil embargo. It would have been unenforceable, but just the threat itself from Nixon and was something that made Gulf leaders in particular very aware that they needed to at least look like they were doing something to protect the sort of food sovereignty or to protect their food supplies. And so they started after this these massive agricultural programs in Saudi Arabia in particular. So this is really when it starts to get introduced in Saudi Arabia. So there are wheat and all sorts of other grain subsidies. The Saudi government also 100% subsidizes the import of cattle from North America and from Canada in particular. That's where they come from at this time. So they're really trying to help set up this new dairy industry, as it turns out, and also just promote livestock more broadly. So that is part of these subsidies, which are generally focused on in the discussions about these agricultural subsidies as grains, but it was also about livestock. Fast forwarding again then rapidly to the next world food crisis we had in 2006 and 2007. And this is when the Saudis also start to phase out those subsidies. By the 1990s, Saudi Arabia had become one of the largest wheat exporters in the world. They were putting massive amounts of their natural resources, specifically the non-replenished, like the aquifers that cannot be replenished, that resource was being tapped for these grain projects and all sorts of farming projects. So they put all of those resources toward promoting this agricultural economy, but that couldn't be sustained. So after this world food crisis, as prices for grains really start to get out of control, the Saudis say, okay, we cannot continue with these policies. We need to shift the subsidy regimes. One of the first things that they do in initially shifting these subsidy regimes is, well, they don't want to alienate the agricultural elite who they had just basically developed over the decades prior of subsidies. Instead, they shift the subsidies that they're giving for domestic grain production to subsidies for foreign land acquisition. So this is when we start to see this first wave of foreign land acquisition efforts. And these deals kind of don't go very far initially in the first years. There's lots of problems with them. They start to go initially to Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. But there happens to be a lot of protests. Farmers don't like this. Governments have problems with this. The taxes are problematic. The legal codes are problematic. There's all sorts of challenges that they encounter in this initial wave of deals. And so it is sort of by the later years that they start to put the investment in developed countries and developed agricultural markets, which we'll see a little bit further later. So and as we'll come back to that, but a dominant thread in all of this is this idea that we need to protect our food supplies, we need to find other ways to source food, etc. These are really large programs. We're talking billions of dollars going into these programs, but they're not going to help the small farmers. That is clear from the very beginning, from the 1970s and even long before that, as I've encountered, that these are primarily supports going to an elite group of people who have access to that. So one of the beneficial narratives to promote a very heavily elite-oriented subsidy regime is that you have a threat. And specifically, you can see that through something like the desert environment. There's also a sort of threat of this sort of classical geopolitics that we could be, that our ports are really quite important to make sure that we are able to maintain our grain supplies, our food supplies. If we get blocked off, then this could be a problem. This is an aside for now, because this is an entirely different topic, but as Qatar has been under embargo for the last years, 3 years almost now, they were very quick to, fly in a bunch of cows and fly in their food. So this was expensive, but they still, this sort of classical determinist view is not sufficient for this. Nonetheless, it looks scary, it looks like you need action, and it looks like you need billions of dollars in subsidies. The desert also helps with that same narrative, and this idea that this is a precarious environment, that the desert cannot sustain large-scale agriculture. Really, it can't. I mean, they can continue to desalinate seawater, but that is just completely uneconomical for agricultural production. For some of the smaller greenhouse projects, et cetera, that may be a possibility, but not for large-scale projects. And so this is why the Saudis kind of come to this bigger agenda after 2008. In 2009, introduced the King Abdullah Initiative for Agricultural Investment Abroad, trying to say, okay, well, we need to diversify our risk here and make sure that we can have grain coming from our own farms and try to source this grain internationally. And one of the things is also a point of anxiety here about this is that there are a number of countries after these food crises that are putting a stop on agricultural exports. So they need to make sure that they can go buy land in a country that's not going to say, okay, well, you have land here, but you cannot ship that grain or whatever it is that you're growing here. You cannot ship that internationally back to Saudi Arabia. So these programs are all sort of a space where they're exploring what these policies can and cannot do and what the challenges might be. So they're aware that this is a sensitive issue when they introduced this, the Ministry of Agriculture sort of saying, look, this is not the global land grab. We're not doing that. We're here to help farmers. But it is nonetheless quite sensitive. So this comes back to this bigger question of why Arizona? Why would they go to develop this particular farm in Arizona? So as I've already sort of alluded to, one of the major points that they arrive at is that they have to go to places that have a developed agricultural market, places that are politically stable and are not going to experience a lot of opposition. All of these things fit Arizona very well. Arizona also is in the desert, and it has a huge amount of sunshine per day. If you can have more sun and you just get more bang for your buck effectively in the production of alfalfa, which is the primary crop that they want to produce here. So as you can see, this is a desert environment. As long as you have water, you can get more from the land in terms of that sort of production. So basically, the push factors pushing these companies and these investors out of Saudi Arabia would be basically the shift in policy regimes, the subsidy regimes, diminishing actual water supplies, et cetera. There's also from the pull side of why go to Arizona is that there are these new subsidies that they are getting for that foreign land acquisition, but also the limited political opposition is really key here. And when I first started asking about this project in Arizona, meeting with a bunch of people in the sort of hydrology sphere at the university, family members, everyone, I started asking, who's working on this topic? Because I assumed that by the time I had the chance to actually get going on it, that somebody had already written about it and it was already, over-researched. And everybody told me, no one. Why would we? We can't do anything about it. You know how messed up Arizona water politics is. I had at least 6 people tell me something almost verbatim like that we can't do anything. And this is people who would be critical, who would be in a position to make some sort of change, all feeling this intense sort of resignation. And the point of some even was to say, well, if it's just one farm, the real problem is over there in those third world countries where they don't have rule of law. Right? And so here we already start to see this sort of American nationalist script of exceptionalism, that the water legal problems that we have here aren't really equivalent to other places that somehow are deemed more corrupt, that the violence to the land here doesn't count. To me, it does, and as a geographer interested in the Arabian Peninsula, it does, so I continue with that project. One of the other major points here is that there's cheap and accessible water. And this is kind of what people are getting at when they make that comment that you know how messed up water politics is. Well, every county of Arizona gets to determine its water management policy. So basically, there are some counties in Arizona that are classified sort of in the active management areas, and there are others that are outside of these active management areas. In the AMAs, you have certain regulations. Some have bizarre management plans that I won't go into, but nonetheless, there are a whole class of counties in Arizona where groundwater pumping is not regulated at all. So the Saudis, when they get this farm in Arizona, they just apply for a bunch of well permits. They are given, and they can pump as much as they want. This is one of the new wells that you can see. So I didn't put in the pictures of kind of behind where you can see this, but they basically just developed a bunch of new sites like this. In a community in rural Arizona, which had long had this sort of presence of agriculture, they were sort of looking at this land at some point of being basically worthless because the groundwater levels are dropping, and they didn't have the capital to put into digging these deeper wells. The Saudis did. So as long as you can drill those wells, then you can have access to that water, and those are the alfalfa fields that they're irrigating. And another view here of those fields. So for me, this is more, this project about deserts is not just about saying these two different desert places are similar in terms of their water problems and their politics and these issues, but rather to look at those direct connections that happen across space, but also time. Because as I discovered in working on this project, there was a lot of Saudi involvement in Arizona in the 1940s. And as it turns out, there's also a team of Arizona farmers that helped set up that first farm in Saudi Arabia at Kharj that I'll talk about in a minute in the 40s. So I'll come back to this point about the Saudis visiting Arizona in the 1940s in a little bit. But basically, what I'm really interested in this part of the project is looking at how these connections around agriculture really sort of facilitated this burgeoning relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States in the 40s in particular. So U.S. started to develop these relationships in the 1930s, but really really the focus on agriculture comes somewhat later in the 40s. So I don't have time too much to talk about the sort of politics of empire and the role of agriculture in it. Let's just say empires are made through colonizing the land. And how do we colonize the land? We grow things on it and we sedentarize populations. There are lots of connections between these two different imperial presences as Saudi Arabia is establishing itself as a legitimate state within the world system, and U.S. efforts to support that. Meanwhile, the U.S. also has its own imperial past in Arizona, which I look at as part of this project. But one of the main things that sort of comes out of this and how we get to the point of the Saudis going to Arizona in the 40s is after the Carl Twitchell agricultural missions, which were sponsored in 42 and 44 by the US government. And this is odd, right? This is during the war. And this was something that King Ibn Saud wanted and had really pushed for to get this agricultural mission to basically trek through all of Saudi Arabia. As you can see, this is sort of the map of where the mission went, to evaluate their water resources and agricultural possibilities for development. So Carl Twitchell was the leader of this project. Twitchell had already become a major advisor to the Saudis back in the 1930s and even before, when he first arrived in the Arabian Peninsula. And he was a geologist. And he really sort of saw his ability to bridge the United States and Saudi Arabia. Twitchell also had spent a fair bit of time in Arizona before, and in fact convinced the King of Saudi Arabia before these reports, or before the ag missions, to send him to the U.S. Southwest to survey the U.S. Southwest water and agricultural developments there, and be able to report back to Saudi Arabia on this. And so after this, then, the king was really pushing the Americans to fund these ag missions. So. Yes. Mm-hmm.
That previous map.
Yes.
Are those rivers?
No, that's their route. Yeah, that's the route that they trekked. Yeah.
Is there any geography here?
Well, I'll come back to it in a bit, but yes, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about this, and what you see also in Twitchell's accounts of the mission that he gets sent on in the Southwest, is there's a big focus on the mileage. The Southwest trip was 15,000 miles, and you see a similar sort of accounting of these ag missions, that they're sort of tabulating as if it's this grand thing in these thousands of miles that they traverse, which surely was no small thing then, right? But nonetheless, it sort of impresses upon you this idea that they spent so much time and really dug in detail. When you actually read the reports, it's very thin, and they're just talking to like one or two people in any given place. So that to me is kind of the you know, my colleague at Syracuse, Mark Monmonier, has written this book, How to Lie with Maps. Yes, this is one of those wonderful cases where, yes, it sort of exaggerates the grandeur of it. So I want to be aware of the time, which I think I have not been, but I'll sort of just quickly sort of move through the work that Twitchell produces. But he's sort of writing up about Saudi water resources, and using this whole trip and this expedition and the big numbers he has behind him to push the U.S. government to fund more interventions in agriculture in particular. And this happens to be what the King of Saudi Arabia wants. So these are these lovely images, you know, of producing watermelons and who knows what else in the middle of the desert. This is largely about starting to build that relationship and that U.S. imperial presence in the Arabian Peninsula kind of starts at this moment, where they're recognizing that in order to get into Saudi Arabia and to develop this relationship specifically, they're really interested in oil and air bases at some point that you can see also in the archives at this moment. But they also recognize that they kind of have to give some concessions. And so for the US government, it seems to me, at least from reading the archival record, that this is one of the concessions that they give to just say, okay, we'll look like we're doing something nice for the Saudis and give them some farmers. Aramco had already figured that out. So when the US sends this team of farmers to Saudi Arabia, they take over a farm that Aramco has been running for a couple of years already. So there's, all this other nice stuff that, in addition to building U.S. and Saudi empire, of fostering this image of imperial benevolence, political allegiances, selling Caterpillar tractors and other things like that. That's certainly in the sphere, but I think the bigger mission is just trying to build this relationship, and agriculture happens to be one element of that. And so how do you establish, or you sort of put roots to that relationship they've been establishing? One thing is that they, as a result of the first agricultural mission report, they send this specialist, David Rogers from USDA, to Saudi Arabia and a team of Arizona farmers. And then also Prince Faisal and Prince Khalid come to Arizona and they tour in 1943. This visit didn't get that much attention, so I won't talk too much about it, but basically all of the reports that I did find talk about how they're touring the agricultural fields. They're looking at sheep raising methods, specifically the Navajo, and they are visiting the Hoover Dam, which is also something that the later visit, which happens in 47, the Saudis also do. But then there is the second visit where you have, at this point, Crown Prince Saud, who comes. And, I just love this picture in so many ways because of this relationship that, it seems so odd that we would be talking about agriculture and the development of this relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. But you can see how happy he is with this chicken, right? So these relationships are quite significant. Crown Prince, then later King Saud, really sort of glows about his visit to Arizona in later years, and also in the press. You can see this. He even asks them to do a little cowboy demonstration for him at one of the farms he visits in Arizona. But it is all about sort of doing this demonstration tour of Arizona farming and agriculture and water management systems. And some of the elite schmoozing that happens with all the sort of Arizona who's who at that moment. This is also from the ASU archives. But for the most part, they're kind of just looking at irrigation ditches. That seems really odd. Okay, maybe this spectacle makes a little bit of sense. But the real question is, are they actually transferring any knowledge by sending the Saudi king and his entourage, or Crown Prince and his entourage around Arizona? They're really not. But they're at least developing that spirit and teaching the Saudis that Arizonans have this special knowledge about farming in the desert. And how else to demonstrate that Arizonans have this special knowledge about farming in the desert than to send one expert and a team of other Arizonans that he works with, or he knew them when he was growing up, in Arizona to Kharj, which is this site here. So kind of to the question before about the geography of this. The Kharj project is a site for the king, from the multiple kings that sort of held this site. It was their favorite destination. They were growing things for the royal family members, but it was nonetheless framed as something that was going to teach things to all of Saudis and was going to teach things to all of Saudi farmers. But it was fundamentally an elite project. So produce and everything was getting sent to the royal family members, and later the grains that were being grown there were getting sent to the nearby dairies, which were also owned by either the royal family or the or well-connected elites like the Minister of Finance. So Al-Kharj is a site that had a lot of underground water, and you could really know that quite early on because of these massive sinkholes where you could see some of the water. And this is one of my predecessors in my geography department, George Babcock Cressy. He died in the 1960s, but as I discovered in this research, he had spent some time at Al-Kharj and toured it and has some amazing photographs at Syracuse University Special Collections from this. So these are some of his images. But it is sort of producing this spectacle of growing alfalfa in the desert, which we had actually seen already in Arizona, or which the Saudis had already seen in Arizona, and which David Rogers and his team already knew from their time in Arizona because of Arizona's history in alfalfa production, which I'll sort of end with in a minute. So as you can see, these are some of the color photographs, which is quite rare because Cressy's images are slides. So you do get some of the color coming from that. But these are the sorts of scenes that you would have seen at Al-Kharj at the time. So the question in all of this, sending this Arizona team to help set up this farm, the question comes about, was this a success? Well, it helped establish that relationship and give a positive view of Americans and of Arizona in particular to the Saudi royalty, and this continued for decades. Beyond that, I think we do really just have to ask, well, whose success and who's really benefiting from this project? So as I mentioned before, this is for all the king's horses, they're getting fed, right? Because he's stabling, I think at one point, in the 50s, around 400 horses in this area, and the best of the best. But in addition to that, later on in the 1950s, early 1950s, the king asks Aramco to help set up a farm, and in particular, a dairy farm. So Aramco employees sort of scurried to help do that, and they do import a bunch of cows from across the United States, as it turns out, and they established these a dairy at Al-Kharj outside of Riyadh, two owned by the royal family and one the Minister of Finance. So for those people, it's certainly beneficial because they're getting all this alfalfa that is getting sent there, basically for free, and Aramco reporters or the sort of accounters were not happy about that. But nonetheless, Aramco benefits in many ways, in the sense that they're creating this goodwill and they're doing the side project that helps promote that positive image of the company, makes them look like they are being supportive of the broader development of Saudi Arabia through agriculture, which again, it wasn't. There were fights. Food could not be sold to villagers. It had to go to the royal family. They were the only ones that could allocate that food. It benefited, the U.S. State Department to some extent, perhaps much less the individual Saudi farmer, though he might learn some skills. But it also, in many ways, sort of benefited Rogers and Twitchell and these others who were able to craft their expertise as the sort of scientists of agriculture in the desert. And this was something burgeoning at that moment, and also something that the University of Arizona and many subsequent generations of Arizonans have figured out how to use to promote their credentials and to promote their science. But at the end of all of this, I would say one of the major winners is that this is sort of the beginning of the Saudi dairy industry or companies in this region. So as I mentioned, Almarai, they now have the mega farms that they have are all located in the Al-Kharj region, which is where this all really got started. So when you look at some of these reports about the unsustainability of Saudi dairy in the desert, yes, there are all sorts of political and environmental problems with that. And yes, it is built on oil wealth, but it is also built on this much longer history of U.S. relationship and U.S. empire building in Saudi Arabia. But this is also something that continues to bind the two regions, right? Because we have now Almarai owning this dairy, or this farm in Arizona and growing alfalfa specifically as an input for that project. But this is also a colonial story. This is also a story that has to begin with thinking about U.S. empire, not just in the Arabian Peninsula, but U.S. empire in the U.S. Southwest. As I mentioned, this project is much bigger. I've been looking at how the U.S. sort of colonized Arizona and as a territory. And one of the major things that you see in all of this boosterist literature of trying to get settlers, white settlers from the East Coast to come to Arizona is related to agriculture. All of it is oriented around agriculture. I mean, you can see even Southern Arizona for the settler. This is explicit language. We need settlers who are white, who are industrious, who will farm the land. And look, there's this glorious array of things that you can grow. And alfalfa is king. In almost all of these documents, they emphasize the role of alfalfa of making these farmers rich. And it is this promise of alfalfa and the wealth that you get from alfalfa production in the desert that is really sold in this early colonial period in Arizona in particular. And so you have, I mean, this is by 1928, you have this sense that Arizona is this place that is exporting all of these agricultural goods across the United States. And you can sort of see some of well, this is just carloads, so who knows how much that really is. But alfalfa hay is pretty high up there, right? So when I hear today Arizonans say, oh, the Saudis are taking our oil, or taking our water, and they're coming here to grow alfalfa here, and that's so wrong. I have to think to myself, you know, what about this history? This is also a history of exploitation, of U.S. settlers coming and taking indigenous land and taking indigenous water. And those sorts of political geographies are just ignored, right? This is our water. Well, whose water is it really, right? There's all these different layers of that. So what I see in a map like this is that it perhaps is not so very different or so very distant from a map like this, where you have Saudi investors coming to Arizona and those sorts of connections across Arizona and across the Saudi presence in the Arabian Peninsula, that these are similar maps, right? But they are not necessarily maps that we can say that we can place in a particular hierarchy, especially not when we discount or we actually start to include the colonial histories and that longer history of Arizona and desert experts from the US going and helping set up the conditions of possibility for a company like Almarai to succeed here. So I know I'm woefully over time here, so I just want to sort of go to final points in this idea of thinking about desert geopolitics. That when thinking about these water and food connections and land in particular, that the securitizing narratives can be a little bit diversionary, right? It's problematic in large part, I would say, because it sort of pushes us away from thinking about that history and that history of entanglement, that Arizona is not the victim here, right? Arizona is part of this story, but this is not a story that fits our comfortable understandings of victimhood and that idea of thinking, you know, of that image I showed earlier of the hands, the disembodied hands stealing the land. Well, who are those people? And where did they come from? Who are their ancestors? So thinking then towards a sort of geopolitics of mapping these connections, it means that we have to bring these ways of thinking across space, across deserts, how people mobilize the desert to justify their presence and justify their involvement in a place place like Saudi Arabia, and linking a bunch of different conversations across the social sciences. I've always loved geography because we are so plural, but we can engage all sorts of other scholars and conversations in policy worlds, thinking through these other fields. And it would sort of end with the last image from the George Cressy slides that I just loved, which he calls this Koch, camel, double exposure, right? And I just love this because this is the sort of double mapping of this double consciousness, as Rob Nixon talks about it, of this sort of environmental history, that we have to keep in focus those colonial histories if we want to talk about today. And it is a very, very tricky task. But this double exposure, it's not a mistake. Right? This is how our systems are built. It is just a matter of how we actually keep that in focus. All right, with that, thank you.
Presentation. I'm sure Natalie will be happy to educate some questions.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. My question is sort of about the size. How large are these holdings in Arizona, but also in Argentina? And how large are they in relation to land that is under similar cultivation in Saudi Arabia?
So the farm in Arizona is 9,800 acres. So it's large, but it's not super large, right? I'm not sure about the Argentina farm, to be honest with you. In Saudi Arabia, in 2000, so they started to phase out production of grain domestically. By the end of 2018, you were not allowed, it was illegal, it was banned to produce forage in Saudi Arabia. So there technically should be no domestic grain production for this. The farms...
90,000 acres, though, is a relatively minor foreign holding, right?
And that's also the story that I was hearing from people in Arizona, which is to say that, well, if it's just one farm, we shouldn't really care about it, because the real problem is, the other dairy companies from out of state, or increasingly, there's a lot of anxiety in California that California is going to start regulating groundwater in new ways, and so all these California farming operations are coming and buying up land in Arizona where they know they won't have those regulations. So that is the size issue is actually not my major concern in all of this, right? It is specifically that's actually what allows us to not pay that much attention to it, and it's part of the story that people in Arizona will give you to why we shouldn't bother, why we shouldn't care about this. To me, it matters because it's politically significant. I study spectacles, so I'm interested in that. But the size is not the major issue. It's a drop in the bucket, to be sure. But nonetheless, I do think that there is a lot of lessons that can be taken from it. And it is also sort of speaks to many of the bigger problems of water regulations and water management in Arizona.
So the total Arab land holding in Arizona is just in this?
So of Almarai is just that farm. They have also a farm a little bit west of that in Blythe, California. And then there's a farm of about the same size from Aldara, the Emirati dairy company, just I don't know, 5 minutes away or something.
Thank you so much.
Like a royal supply. Small supply.
Yeah.
It's very, very provocative. Thank you so much. I have two questions, and it's about, I don't know if you have explored this, the several triangulations here, right? While say Saudi Arabia is dealing in this way, in this modernizing interactions with the new empire, the U.S. in the 1930s on, before 20s on. Meanwhile, we have Israel, right? In a process that is very similar, right? It's a process of modernization, hyper-modernization, subsidies, international interactions, U.S., Israel, right? And agriculture at the center, right, of it,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Then that's one of my questions. And the second is something connected to what is happening today. Due to the ban of forage in Saudi Arabia, we have seen clearly geographical interest or geopolitics play with Yemen. Yemen, that is the only place in the Arabian Peninsula that has actually water, right? That is a very different landscape there. Then, are you exploring that kind of connections through that? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for both great questions. So first on the question of Israel, this is a really interesting case, specifically because, the projects that I'm working on in the Emirates are related to agriculture experiment stations and the work of, well, also in Oman. So looking at the history of these agricultural experiment stations, the U.S. starts to set up these ag experiment stations across the U.S., and it starts to extend its empire through these experiment stations within the United States in the 1800s, in the mid-1800s on. The very first international one is opened in 1905 in Israel, and it runs until 1911, and one of the major people behind the Zionist movement in Israel is Aaron Aronson, who is, he comes and he tours the United States and he looks at all these sort of ag experiment stations, and everybody says, well, why don't you go set one up in Israel? So the US helps support this particular project. And he is, one of the major leaders in this sort of movement of greening Israel and colonizing it through this, quite early on, with as we've seen, U.S. support for that, and so that is something that comes very, very early in that relationship and becomes quite significant in that sort of Israeli presence and control of land through water, or water through land, which however you want to think about it. The other question, specifically about Yemen, I haven't focused on this directly. However, when I was in Oman in January, I was somewhat surprised to hear that they are still getting a lot of the agricultural and other goods from Yemen, still in Oman, and they're also getting things from Syria still. So, but this is specifically around agriculture. So for whatever reason, there's those sorts of flows are still working, and it's difficult for those producers and those relationships, but it is nonetheless continuing today. So I haven't really dug much deeper beyond that, but yes, those flows continue, obviously in a different capacity. So.
Hey, thank you for the great presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sourcing. I was just curious how easy it was to get information that you felt was accurate or that you trusted, given the protection of agriculture in Arizona, and then, of course, of the Saudi royal family.
So are you asking about the historical period or the contemporary period?
Either.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've looked at a lot of different archives at the moment. In the historical side, from the case of the Saudis going to Arizona, there it wasn't sensitive at all. It was just an issue of locating the right information. I still have not made it to the National Agricultural Library, which is where I suspect I might encounter some of David Rogers' papers, but I don't know. I've asked every Gulf historian to locate anything related to him, and I've come up basically empty-handed. So what I have are second-hand accounts from like the 1950s or so. Some of the foreign records of the United States, the State Department archives essentially, which are online, you can find some accounts of him and some quotes from him at that moment. So it's really just an issue of tracing. I would say that kind of applies to all of the archival work that I've been doing. And even Aramco world, they're really happy to share images and other documents. It's a very easy process. And ironically, this is perhaps more to the Oman and the Emirati case that I have been working on. The University of Arizona, which is really at the center of a lot of this research, has not been very easy to work with in some of these cases. So much of the information that I know about some of the time periods I found in Emirati archives, and then that has led me elsewhere because University of Arizona is not happy or doesn't want to give me access to certain periods or certain kinds of information. The other piece on the sort of contemporary issues in water in Arizona, that piece I'm still working on a bit, but people in the water sector have been more than happy to speak with me. For the most part, they just kind of do the, why do you even care spiel, which, you know, it is what it is. But nonetheless, they will talk. They just think that it's endangering their project of shifting the conversation around water in Arizona by just going with a red herring, as one person told me, that it just kind of diverts from this bigger problem that we have, which is all these Californians coming and stealing our water. You know, it's wherever their priorities lie.
So let us thank Dr. Koch for being here today and for sharing her information.